the personalization paradox, welfare effects of personalized recommendations in two-sided digital markets. The title's a bit long. We're going to break down what a few of these keywords mean, and then we'll get into the research question. So recommendation systems determine where products appear in the page when we search for products online or hotels. So here's an example from Expedia. The recommendation system is determining which products appear in the order that they appear in. To personalize the recommendation system means that the algorithm is taking into account information about that individual to curate this assortment. And that can be incredibly personal information like past interactions on the website and purchase history or cookies passed on from other websites. It can also be somewhat less personal information like what time of day is the person searching, what country are they searching from, things like that. Okay, so that is recommendation systems. Now for two-sided digital markets, again, I said the context I'm going to think about is Expedia, but it could be more general. So in this setting, we have two sides. We have sellers, so think of hotels selling room nights. We have consumers like us when we're searching for a hotel. And then we have online platforms. So here we have Expedia, that's the intermediary. Now, each of these groups get to make a few strategic decisions. So the online platform gets to choose their design, and this includes the recommendation system. Notably, Expedia in this setting and these platforms don't always get to choose prices. And so if we have third-party sellers, they're the ones who get to choose prices. And then consumers make their search and purchase decisions. So if we think about how we're seeing this in the data, you can think of a search as a click and a purchase as someone booking a room night. But it could be something a little more detailed, like how intensely someone's reading the website, things like that. Okay, so one thing I want to preview is here, I've color coded a few things. So the recommendation system is in orange. And what we're going to think about are different potential recommendation systems Expedia could choose. What we're going to do is we're going to vary the level of personalization for those recommendation systems. And based on each of those, we're then going to endogenize the prices the sellers set and the search and purchase decisions the consumers make. Zooming out from Expedia, how common is it where we have a platform that gets to choose the design, but third-party sellers that get to choose prices? In accommodations, it's quite common. So between Expedia Booking and Airbnb in 2022, we had almost $500 billion in transaction revenue happen through those websites. We also see it for restaurants and groceries. So if any of you are familiar with Instacart or Grubhub, like the restaurants and grocery stores on those platforms are the ones setting prices, not the platforms themselves. We have it for event tickets, and it's also worth highlighting that even on Amazon, which we think of as a hybrid platform where they have their own products, they're also selling alongside third-party sellers. About 60% of units sold are still from third-party sellers who have the ability to change the price if they want to. Okay, so we did a speed run through what are recommendation systems, what does it mean to personalize them, and what are two-sided digital markets. That brings us to the research question, which is what are the welfare effects of personalized recommendations, specifically when the sellers can adjust their prices and when the consumers can update their beliefs. And by that, I mean their beliefs about what the recommendation system is showing. Now, we have some examples of this from the literature, where much of the literature so far suggests that personalization or other improvements to recommendation systems can be quite good for consumers. This is often called the long tail effect. One of the intuitions is that as you increase the level of personalization, we have higher match quality, so consumers match to products that better fit their tastes. Maybe they're able to find a match without having to search as intensely, and we tend to think of search as costly. Those can both increase consumer welfare. Most of the focus of that research is either on A/B tests, which are small scale experiments, on engagement goods where there's not a relevant price, or generally an approach that holds sellers' strategy fixed. This paper is really going to focus on what happens to prices. So what we're going to do next is we're going to go through 3 examples of the forces that might hopefully convince you that prices would change if we change the recommendation system. Okay, so this first example is just a little cartoonish. It's what I call the Elvis Hotel. So imagine a fictional hotel that's Elvis themed. It's a niche good. And we have 2 types of consumers. We have a typical online shopper and our Elvis type consumer. And the Elvis type consumer has a high willingness to pay for Elvis themed goods. Now, under a default recommendation system, the platform determines who's more exposed to this hotel. The default recommendation system might steer consumers that look a lot like the population distribution of consumers. So we'll have many of our typical online shoppers and only the occasional Elvis type consumer match the hotel. And then the hotel sets their prices, and they're setting prices based off of this set of consumers that are exposed to it through the platform. And so they might choose a price of $120 a night. Now, what happens if we personalize the recommendation system? If the recommendation system's good, the composition might look different, and it might look more like this, where now we're matching more of the Elvis type consumers to the Elvis type hotel. Maybe these typical online shoppers have some other niche preference that they're being steered to instead. And so this is kind of this long tail effect. This is the efficiency gain we typically see in the literature, Elvis type consumer, Elvis type hotel. That could be an easy welfare gain. But now the hotel is facing demand from a different set of consumers. And this set of consumers on average is going to be, has a higher willingness to pay. So they might be able to profit by increasing their price. And so this is the main trade-off of the paper, which is we have better matches, but we also face higher market prices. There are two things I want to pause and note here. The first is the context of this paper, which is it's not a paper about price discrimination. That's something we might worry about where either the hotel or the platform knows which consumer is which type and can charge each type a different price. In this setting, we have the market price changing. So let's say you're an Elvis type consumer. There's no use hiding which type you are because you're still facing the same market price as everyone else, but now you have worse recommendations. The other thing to point out is that the way that these platforms often test and deploy these recommendation systems is through small experiments and A/B tests. So let's say they're using the default recommendation system and they want to test some new promising personalized recommendation system. What do? They carve out 0.5% of their consumers, they show them the new recommendation system, and they track the difference between that new recommendation system and the like 99 or more percent of consumers that are having see the default. And maybe they'll see, yeah.
Sorry, there's a clarifying question on the chat from Alex Murring. He's asking, what is the platform optimizing for in its ranking? Are they trying to maximize bookings, profit, or something else?
That's an excellent question. So I'll get to that in a second. The way I think about it here is typically like the data science team has some loss function that they're trying to match. So like the common one would be the normalized discounted cumulative gain, which is really closer to trying to maximize conversions than profits specifically. But we can jump to that in a bit.
Thank you.
Okay. So where was I? So the firms deploying these recommendation systems might run a small experiment with the personalized recommendation where a small percent of consumers see it. They'll see that, oh, they're booking way more, and they'll launch it for everyone. The limitation is that from the perspective of the hotels during this experiment, the demand they face still looks like the default recommendations because the vast majority of consumers are still seeing this one default recommendation system. And so they're not going to strategically respond the way they would if it were launched for everyone. Okay, so that's the main.
There's another question, which I think is important right now, from Govind Kumawat. Do sellers know about the platform's recommendation system?
Yeah, so in the setting, we'll get into the modeling. So I would say that the way I have it set up when we jump to the model is that the firms know their own and cross-price elasticities the way we would assume they do it in most supply-side settings. And the recommendation system is part of that as well as consumer preferences.
Great.
Okay, it's a good question. Okay, the other two, and in the interest of time, I'll go a little more quickly through these. So one of them is that recommendation systems are often a function of price, and that sellers can improve their position by decreasing their price. We already know from the literature that we have these strong position effects. So products higher in the page are going to get more views and they're going to get more purchases. So sellers can increase their sales volume by lowering price through the recommendation system. That means that the equilibrium prices we see in the data are going to be a function of whatever the prevailing recommendation system is at the time. If we personalize, it's unclear which direction we're going, so it could make the recommendation system less price sensitive or more price sensitive. That's an empirical question. I'm going to come back to this later because this also ends up being an important policy lever for the results we see later on in the talk. And the last one is the co-ranking of close substitutes. So now imagine instead of one Elvis themed hotel, we have two Elvis themed hotels. Depending on whether the recommendation system ranks them far apart from each other or close together, you could imagine changes the level of price competition between those products, right? So Elvis type consumer shows up, they see the Elvis hotel. If this is buried at the bottom of the page, then this firm almost has a monopoly compared to when they're both showing up together, and then they really have to compete on price. Okay, so those are the three main forces. It's the composition of demand, it's the competition for product rankings, and the co-ranking of close substitutes. Jumping into what this paper specifically does, we've been through the research question. I'm going to use clickstream data from Expedia on hotel searches and purchases. These are actually publicly available data. A few other papers have used them. It's really a tremendous resource. It's from a competition Expedia hosted to improve their recommendation system. Using those data, I'm going to do a few things. So first, I'm going to show some reduced form evidence to motivate how I model things. This is going to show evidence that information frictions are quite important. So I'm going to show evidence of both search costs and consumer beliefs driving position effects, so the advantage products on the page have. From there, I'm going to develop a structural model with three parts. There's a demand model, which is an optimal sequential search model, a platform recommendation model, which is a machine learning task where I reverse engineer Expedia's recommendation system at the time, and a hotel pricing model. And this is going to model the hotel's pricing behavior based on both preferences and the recommendation system. Once I have my estimates from the demand model and the supply side from the hotels, then I can use that to evaluate different counterfactuals, including different recommendation systems. So the next thing is I need a few recommendation systems to test. And so I'm going to train 4 increasingly personalized recommendation systems using data from an experiment Expedia ran where they randomized the order that products appeared. No, I'm not necessarily going to play at being a computer scientist or data scientist here. One of the nice things about this competition was to collect your prize money. You had to give a very detailed presentation of exactly what you did. And so these counterfactuals are going to be based on the winning entry of the competition. And from there, I can combine the structural model and these recommendation systems, and I'll evaluate a few counterfactuals. I'm going to do this both holding prices fixed and allowing the prices to change. I'll also do versions where we have capacity constraints versus no capacity constraints. Okay, to preview the results. So first, I'm going to show that both search costs and consumer beliefs drive position effects. Where I think this state of the literature before that was mostly focused on the search cost mechanism and not consumer beliefs. This can be quite important if we're thinking about short-term versus long-run effects of these changes. So if you imagine we're in a world where only search costs impact demand, on the demand side, if you change the recommendation system, the demand adjustment would be immediate. Whereas if beliefs are important, then it would take some time for consumers to update their knowledge of what the recommendation system is doing and change their behavior. If I hold prices fixed to match the literature so far, it looks like this is a welfare gain. So consumer surplus would go up by, it would be about $1 billion for the year 2013. However, once we allow the sellers to update their prices, it turns into a welfare loss. So what I see is something consistent with a market becoming more segmented and less competitive. So quantity decreases by 4.5%. The sellers increase their profits by about 5%. The platform, had they gone through all this effort, ends up no better off because they get a percent cut of revenue and the price has gone up and the quantity's gone down in a way where they end up with the same amount of revenue at the end. And the consumers end up losing about $2 billion. So this would be about 5% of total booking revenue. They're losing almost twice as much as the hotels are gaining. So this would be a loss for consumers, and it would also be a total welfare loss. I think this highlights a potentially overlooked concern in e-commerce platform research and regulation, which is that better recommendation systems may end up reducing competition and harming consumer welfare. Okay, so this touches a few areas of the literature. It builds on a lot of tremendous work. I'd say the one I want to focus on is really the main contribution is thinking about seller responses to platform design questions. And this is endogenizing the seller pricing behavior based on improving the recommendation system. Okay, so the outline with the last 25 minutes, I'm gonna go through a bit more of the data and setting. We'll go through evidence of the position effects and what the potential drivers are. Then we'll dive into the structural model. We're gonna spend most of the time on the demand model, a little bit on the recommendation system training, counterfactuals, and then I wanna spend the last few minutes focusing on these price-tuned recommendation systems. Like I said earlier, the data come from Expedia. They hosted a competition on Kaggle.com to improve their recommendation system, specifically through personalization. It's really rare to get these kinds of data outside of like a really strict data sharing agreement with a firm. So this is a fantastic resource and it's publicly available. It includes impressions, clicks, and purchases for the first page. So imagine up to 36 products when someone searches. It includes characteristics about the hotel, location attractiveness, information, users' aggregate purchase history, some information about other online travel agencies. And importantly, it also includes an experiment. So 2/3 of the data come from their default recommendations. 1/3 of the data come from an experiment where they randomize the order. So if you were to search for a hotel in Boston, you would still get hotels in Boston, but the order would be completely random of which hotels show up in the rankings. So as a reminder of what these platforms look like closer to that time, we have what's called the landing page. So this is where you see the search results from Ann Arbor, where I went to grad school. And we have a small set of the product features. We might see a price, some information about the reviews, and maybe a profile picture. And once you click, you can learn a lot more information, like does it have a pool? What location is it in? More information about the reviews. And then once you dive in, you might learn the final price. So here's an example where we have somewhat opaque pricing where we have a tax that's added on at the end. So the final price is different than what you pay when you search on the landing page. Okay, so going through now the three main empirical findings that are going to inform the structural model. So the first is going to be that slot. This is position on the page impacts demand even when the recommendations are random. So here we are plotting data from two regimes. One is the default recommendations, and the second are on the right are the random recommendations. Now, if we focus on the default recommendations, we're plotting the concentration of bookings and clicks. And we see that the products that are at the top of the page have most of the bookings and most of the clicks. If we're in our standard full information world like BLP, where we assume consumers know everything, we might still expect this pattern in the data if the recommendation system is good, because maybe it's just putting the better products higher on the page. However, if that were the case, what would we expect in the random rankings? We would expect a uniform distribution because these products are no different from each other. It's an entirely random order. But instead, what we see is that most of the clicks and most of the purchases, it's noisier, but they're still at the top of the page, which suggests that there's some information friction that's important. So this means that the position effects depend more on just the visible product features. It could be search costs or beliefs. The next thing I want to point out is that position on the page is correlated with hidden product features. So on Expedia at the time, you don't learn the precise location of the hotel until you click. You get to learn the neighborhood. So imagine you're searching for a stay at the beach. You'll know that the hotel is near the beach, but until you click, you won't learn that it's actually on the beach or a few blocks away from the beach. These are two scores Expedia provides. You can imagine that a higher score is better for the location desirability. And for both of these scores, they're incredibly correlated with position on the page. This means that consumer beliefs could drive position effects. So we see that important information, product features that are hidden are correlated with position on the page. This also suggests that if we run an A/B test like the randomization, that might not fully disentangle position effects for us because the consumers in the A/B test don't know they're part of an experiment. And so their clicks still might be based on their beliefs about the prevailing recommendation system at the time. Okay, this is less surprising, so I'll skip over it in the interest of time. It's just that position on the page depends on price. From the data, we can see that hotels can improve their position by lowering their. This means that we need a supply side that models strategic reactions to changes in the recommendation system on the side of hotels. Diving into the structural model, so it has three parts. The first part is most of the work of the paper is in the demand model. So this is an optimal sequential search model. One of the key features is that position on the page. So slot impacts demand both through search costs and through beliefs. It's important to have both of these mechanisms because when we change the recommendation system, we need to be able to update consumers' beliefs so that they know that now there are products that are better match their taste higher up on the page instead of just allowing it through search costs alone. I estimate it using maximum simulated likelihood. One of, I think, the methodological contributions here is since beliefs matter, since they're hidden product features, there's some additional estimation challenges, which I tackle using an inner loop to solve for reservation utilities. The next is the platform model. The platform model reverse engineers Expedia's recommendation system at the time. When I was on the job market, this was harder to explain because I'm using this trick from cryptography called model extraction, where basically it says that if you have a machine learning model and you see all its inputs and its outputs, you can train another model that replicates its behavior quite well. But now there's debate in the AI space about firms stealing models from other firms by using their models. And like, this is essentially what I'm doing here. And so now it's been a little easier to explain to people. I need to combine both of these to get elasticity of demand. So compared to the standard setting, where if we imagine we have like demand for automobiles, where we have downward sloping demand, the downward sloping demand comes from a disutility of price. In this setting, if a firm changes the price, we also have to think about how it's going to change in the rankings. And so I combine the platform model and the demand model to get elasticity of demand. And I need that for the supply side. So on the supply side, this is a bit more standard. The hotels are choosing prices. It's pretty close to the BLP approach where I'm using BLP type instruments, which are the features of rival firms. It's a dynamic pricing problem. So the estimation is pretty standard, just the interpretation is a little different, or instead of it being the marginal cost of production, it's going to be a marginal opportunity cost. So if I sell a room night today, that means it's not necessarily available for me to sell tomorrow when demand might be higher, or on another platform, or through my own channel. The other thing worth noting is there are convex costs here. So there's both economies of scale and soft capacity constraints. So at low occupancy, we might have decreasing marginal costs. But then as we get closer to our occupancy limit, as quantity goes up, the marginal cost is going to increase for these firms. Going to dive a bit more into the details of the demand model. This is most of the work of the paper, and to have these counterfactuals at the end, it really required a flexible model. So in this setup, we're going to have our per night indirect utility. It's going to involve two segments. So one is going to be visible and another part is hidden. The deltas are going to be from observables. So this is either consumer or product observables, and the epsilons are match quality terms. There's a visible match quality term and a hidden match quality term. To learn the hidden features and the hidden match quality, the consumers need to pay some search costs, and that's going to depend on position on the page. The other thing that ends up being important is that consumers search for different lengths of stay. So this is the per night utility. The final utility the consumers get is going to be a function of how long their stay is, the per night utility, and the total search cost of all the clicks they make along the way. That difference ends up really helping for identification, which we'll talk about later on. Okay, I'll skip these details in the interest of time. So the demand model ends up being quite large. The paper is about personalization. If I had a simple demand model where everyone was the same, I would get the obvious result that personalization isn't important. Instead, I need a model that is quite flexible. So the visible features are going to include the indicators for the star rating of the hotel and whether or not they belong to a brand, flexibly allowing the property review score. So these are the online ratings to enter demand through a spline. There's also consumer segment groups based on what time they're searching, how far ahead of the search they are, how far away from the location they are. Other things that you think might enter the recommendation system also enter this model. The hidden features are going to be the hidden price. So part of the price appears on the landing page, and then taxes and fees and upgrades and things like that end up hidden. So that's a hidden product feature along with the location desirability scores. We'll also have some random coefficients for additional flexibility on search costs, price, the star ratings, and the insight option. To estimate it, I construct a joint likelihood. This is maximum simulated. Sorry, this is maximum simulated likelihood. You can use the optimal sequential search rules from Weitzman in the Logit smoothing approach that you can see in train. There are two sample selection issues I adjust for. One is that the data only includes observations where people clicked at least one time. That I can fix using just by adjusting the likelihood. And the other is that since this was a data science competition, observations where people eventually make a purchase end up being much more important than ones where they don't. And so for the purposes of the data science competition, they oversampled observations that ended in a purchase. I adjust for this using sample weights. This is the last page of complicated, second to last page of complicated math, I promise, and then we'll zoom back out later on. So to estimate it, we already have utility. We have the search cost, which is going to be flexible. This just means that we're using a spline, so we're not making any strict assumptions about how position on the page impacts search costs. It's entered flexibly. The last thing we need is the reservation utility, which is going to depend on the visible part of utility, the expectation of the hidden utility, plus this term. In search models, this term is what causes the headache. So in search models, the reservation utility really solves some implicit function. This is a parameter that's the solution to that implicit function. The reason I'm going through the details is that one of the innovations of this paper is that it comes up with a way to quickly solve in an inner loop for this in a way that allows us to have these hidden product features. Okay. For identification, this is maximum simulated likelihood. So in some sense, everything identifies everything. The sequential search rules end up being important. And so, for example, we have random coefficients here. For each search, I get to see a few things. I get to see what they clicked, what they purchased, or if they didn't purchase anything. Those are multiple revealed preferences, and that helps me pin down the random coefficients of the model. Going back to nights, this ends up being an incredibly important source of variation. So one of the challenges in search models is to separately identify whether products are ones that people don't like very much or are very costly to search, right? So imagine you see data where people just aren't making very many purchases. It's possible that we're in a world where this just is a product people don't like very much, or it's really costly to search. Since I have variation in the number of nights, I have different consumers, some staying for 4 nights and some for one night, for example. The ones staying for 4 nights are going to get 4 times the utility from their purchase. So the returns to search are incredibly high compared to the consumers staying for one night. However, when they're sitting there searching on the website, presumably the search costs they face are the same. And so I have variation the returns to search while holding the search cost fixed, and this helps me separately identify my search costs from my preferences. So these are the results of the demand model. These aren't targeted moments, so we're doing quite well at getting position effects in terms of purchases. It's still a working paper, so there's room for improvement in terms of being able to match the clicks. It's the end of the demand model. So the rest of it, I promise, is going to be way less detailed. So we zoomed in, and now we're going to be a bit less technical here. So for the platform model, this is, like I said, is a machine learning task. So just imagine that we have some score that each product gets that's used for ranking them. Part of it is deterministic, and part of it is random. And it's quite common in industry to have somewhat random recommendation systems. Part of this is experimental variation to be able to back out better, like run experiments later on. Other parts are to make sure that you get a good assortment, where if it were fully deterministic, the same set of products would always appear, and then the seller side might not want to participate in the market if they're not showing up on the page. Now, these can be, even from where my data come from, like these can be very sophisticated black box algorithms. And so what I'm going to do is I'm going to use this machine learning approach where I approximate this psi function, which is just a function of all the observables about the products and the consumers searching. Sorry. I'm going to do that using LambdaMART. This is a really popular machine learning algorithm used for rankings. It was actually the algorithm that won this competition. It also used to be the underlying algorithm for Bing. I'm going to create out-of-fold predictions, and then I'm going to normalize that score and fit a Logit to it to get the exact elasticity, the price elasticities for the recommendation system. So how well does this do? Here we're plotting the predicted position on the horizontal axis and the actual position on the vertical axis. So if I were perfectly backing out what the recommendation system does, I would see a dark line all the way down the diagonal, doing close to pretty well. So about 72, 73% of the time out of sample, it's correctly ranking one product over another. As you can see, it's doing quite well where we have most of the economic activity at the top of the page. And the next step is to take those scores and fit them to a Logit. We can skip over that. Okay. The next part is the supply side. So here the sellers are going to be maximizing expected profits. We have some fee that goes both the taxes into the platform. I don't necessarily observe that, but I don't need to observe that to model the hotel's behavior. We have the average variable cost. And again, this is going to be the average variable cost, but it's an opportunity cost. The expected quantity. And then for the first order conditions, this depends on the elasticity of demand. This depends on both the recommendation system and consumer preferences. So going back to someone's question earlier about what the sellers know, here I'm assuming they know their own and cross-price elasticities. And that's going to be kind of the combine of both knowing preferences and what the recommendation system's doing. You can think in practice, like the directors of revenue management at these hotels are quite sophisticated. For example, if the recommendation system changes, they might do something a little naive where they say like, oh, I'm selling out way faster than I normally would, so I'm going to increase my prices. We can do like they have a few levers to get to the equilibrium in these situations. Okay. The model does include these convex costs. So this is economies of scale and soft capacity constraints. One of the things is it means the first order conditions are not necessarily separable. And so I need to instrument for demand, which in this case is endogenous. I'm going to use BLP type instruments. This is pretty standard. So these are going to be the mean and variance of the features of other products in the same market. I'm going to instrument for quantity and quantity squared. So this gives me this parameter gamma 1 on quantity gives me the economies of scale. So if this is negative, that means at low occupancy, I have decreasing marginal costs. The parameter on quantity squared, I hope is positive. And so that gives me increasing costs as we get to higher and higher quantities. So here are the results. I have two versions. One is pooled and one is I run it for each star rating on its own. Aside from this two-star rating, the sign is the way we would expect for everything, where we have negative on the quantity and positive on the quantity squared, which is giving us this convex cost that we would expect in this industry. Okay, so that's the most detailed part. That's the structural model where we have a demand model, a recommendation system model, and a supply side model. Now I get to train the recommendation systems based on the winning entry. This is just saying I'm following the rules of the competition. So one of the nice things here is instead of needing to back out the firm's strategy, Expedia stated, here's our loss function. And it's complicated. I hope you're ready. A booking is a 5, a clicking is a 1, and an impression is a 0. That's the score, and we're trying to maximize to that in this setting. Okay. So I'm going to train 4 versions that are increasingly personalized. The way I increase the level of personalization is by giving the algorithm access to more data. The least personalized version is only going to have product features. The most personalized is, and I'm going to increase the level of personalization by giving it more features. So the query level is we're going to add information that the consumers actively volunteer. So they, for example, could say, I'm traveling with children, or I'm staying for 4 nights. These are things they enter in the search. The next I'm calling personalized. So this is information you can tell about that person at that point in time, but they're not actively volunteering. This is like passively collected, which is how far in advance of the stay are they searching, what country are they searching from, variables like that. Then the most personalized information is going to be tracked information. And so this is the summary statistics of their past purchases on the website, along with some cookie information that's passed on from like Bing or Google to Expedia.
Aaron, can I ask
Yes.
you a quick question? Which one of the four algorithm counterfactuals that you are highlighting most closely match the algorithm that Expedia was using at the time?
Uh, okay, so it's hard to say because the algorithm, that's a really good question. I would say the query one is what I would say matched the closest. And the reason I say that is when I trained the the version where I had to back out the recommendation system Expedia was using, going from here to here, the model did much better. But once I added the consumer features and the purchase history features, like the model performance got worse. And so that tells me I would expect that gives me the suspicion that they weren't using these features yet at the
Perfect. Thank you.
okay.
And
So
sorry,
the
I'm going to
counterfactual,
use
yeah.
this to tell you that you have 2-3 minutes max.
Okay, great. Okay, so in that case, let's jump to the results. So in terms of the setup, we can think about updating just the recommendation system, updating the prices, updating the beliefs. I'm going to show that both search costs and consumer beliefs, or I showed that the consumer beliefs end up being quite important in driving position effects. So the main version of the model includes that in the results. If we hold prices fixed, we have results similar to the literature where if we hold prices fixed, consumer surplus increases. So consumers are matching to products that better fit their tastes. But again, once we allow the sellers to update their prices, so this is going from the baseline to most personalized, the market becomes more segmented and less competitive. So we have a 4.5% decrease in quantity and a 5% increase in profits. The platform has this minimal change in revenue, right? So they get a percent cut of revenue. The price has gone up, the quantity's gone down, and they end up in the same spot. And the consumers end up worse off. So they would lose about $2 billion in consumer surplus. So that's going from the baseline to most personalized. What happens if we look in the middle? And I'll actually jump to this figure. So here we're plotting the result in blue of the change in consumer surplus for each version of the counterfactual. And what we see is generally a decrease in consumer surplus as we increase the level of personalization. The orange line is telling us the utility of their final choice. So this is going to include how well does this match their taste, as well as what they're losing from price. And what's happening here is the prices are so much higher that they're ending up choosing lower utility items once we include the effect of price. Notably, we do see some efficiency gain from search costs where consumers are making their final decision without searching as intensely. So this yellow line is saying there's some welfare gain from search, the search process being improved, but it's not enough to offset the losses we have from the higher prices. Okay, so the primary result is that we have a welfare loss when sellers update prices. The loss increases with the level of personalization. And I think this could highlight an overlooked concern in e-commerce platform research and regulation, which is that better recommendation systems may end up reducing competition. This is a bit of a depressing result. So the next part I'm working on is to say, like, are there policy alternatives? This brings me to what I call a price-tuned recommendation system. The idea is if we go back to those three forces, the second one is that the firms have to compete for better positions on the page. The idea here is that we adjust the recommendation system. We add an extra parameter on price that can increase or decrease how sensitive it is to price. That can discipline the seller side of the market. So imagine if this is the recommendation system, it's a function of price and everything else. Imagine this is the most personalized one. Imagine if we jump to this, where it's a function of alpha times price plus everything else, and then we get to choose the alpha. And when I say we, I mean, you could imagine that the platforms might be quite interested in this. You could also imagine through the DMA with algorithmic transparency rules, that's something that might also be relevant to a regulator. So this is simulated data, but this is what it might look like. So here we have four different possible objective functions. You could also imagine a combination of these. We're plotting the alpha on the horizontal axis, and you might imagine you can increase total surplus by making the personalized recommendation system more sensitive to price. You could increase consumer surplus even more by making it even more price sensitive than that. On the hotel side, they might want a less price sensitive recommendation system. Though it's worth noting that you would expect the hotel profits to go down at some point, because if you make it not sensitive to price enough, then it's just the recommendation system ends up not showing very relevant options to people. Okay, so in the last minute, I'm going to conclude. So the paper has three main parts. There's a structural model that has a demand model, platform model, and a supply side model. From there, I train a set of recommendation systems using the random data from the experiment Expedia ran, and they're based on the winning entry in the competition. And I increase the level of personalization by giving it the algorithm access to more variables. Then I run counterfactuals based on the default recommendation system, increasing the level of personalization. We ignore price updates and find a welfare gain. We include price updates and find a welfare loss. The thing I didn't have time to talk about is the capacity constraints, which we can think of removing capacity constraints is similar to entry. There, I still find a welfare loss, but it's smaller than in the main version. And the next step is to refine this price-tuned personalized recommendations. So what is the personalization paradox? It's that as you increase the level of personalization, consumer welfare goes down. On one hand, it improves by steering consumers to products that better fit their tastes. However, the sellers are able to take advantage of less price-sensitive consumers and increase prices, and that can more than entirely offset the efficiency gains you get from the better algorithm. So I'll stop there. Thank you so much, and I'm looking forward to the discussion.
Thank you, Aaron. Stefan, you can take it away.
All right, well, thank you very much for inviting me to discuss this paper. I really enjoyed reading it. As you could probably tell, there's a lot going on in the paper. The draft sits at 63 pages, so that's, I guess, the demand of the job market right now. So I first wanted to maybe take a step back and sort of make the case how I think about why this is really a first order question in terms of thinking about how do online markets work, right? So there used to be this idea in the early days of e-commerce when Amazon was just selling books that as retail was moving online, search costs would come down dramatically because now the competing product was just one click away. It would be super easy for consumers to search, and that would lead prices to drop, price dispersion to disappear. And basically, we've not seen any of this, right? And so now that we've actually gotten access to clickstream browsing data, what we see in a lot of data sets, including the one that Aaron analyzes, is that typically out of huge assortments, people click maximum on a handful of products before making their final purchase. What that means in turn is that how the platform presents things to the consumer is going to have a massive effect on what they ultimately end up purchasing. So I think understanding the steering incentives that the platform has and which products they push them to is really first order in understanding these markets, right? So I think that leads us to the research on self-preferencing, which is a little bit related. Chiara has worked in this area. But I think what's interesting here is, so self-preferencing has, at least a priori, there could be a tension between what the platform wants and what's good for consumers. What Aaron analyzes is something that a priori looks totally innocuous. I'm making more personalized recommendations, things are better matched to consumers' tastes. But what he shows us that when prices adjust, that could actually be a bad thing. So I think that's sort of a really intriguing and provocative finding. And so the first comment I wanted to make, I would sort of find it helpful to dig a little bit more into sort of the primitives of the economic forces that drive that effect. So I tried to think through in your Elvis hotel example, right? So what you get for the individual niche hotel is basically a demand shock that comes from the improved personalization, right? So the Elvis hotel gets an outward shift in the demand curve. And if you think about sort of a micro 101 demand supply setting, as demand shifts out, it's going to move along the supply curve. It's going to lead to more quantity transacted and higher prices. What's interesting here, and what I still find a little bit surprising, and I sort of want to understand what's driving that, is that in your setting, prices actually go up so much that quantity goes down in equilibrium. That's what you find in the end. So in a simple one good model, that would never happen, I think. So but I think here in a differentiated good setting, there's search frictions on top of it. So I'm by no means doubting that that's happening, but I sort of wondered what are the minimal ingredients that get you to that effect? Because ultimately, because there's so much going on, we see this effect through the lens of your multiple stages of the model. So I think if you could translate the Elvis Hotel model in sort of a little toy example that walks us through these things, that would be really interesting. I think that would sort of help also understand under what conditions does this effect arise? Is that specific to the Expedia setting? Do we generally expect to see that? So I think that would sort of make the point a little bit broader. The second point, I actually found it a little unusual that you framed it as potentially a regulatory problem. So one of the things that came out of one of your tables is that, and I would again say somewhat surprisingly, because total quantity transacted goes down, which leads to the welfare decrease, it's actually also a profit decrease for the platform to personalize more. Right? So they wouldn't have themselves an incentive to implement the personalization to that degree. And I don't think that makes the paper any less interesting by any ways, but it's maybe a different framing, right? So there'll be a market force. That means although maybe we have the means to do personalization, the platform actually doesn't have an incentive to do it because they know that these adjustments will happen. So I think that might be something sort of interesting to dig into, but if the platform doesn't benefit from it itself, it's not so clear it leads this regulatory means. So I think that distinguishes it a bit from self-preferencing. I make a final point. I know we're sort of probably out of time here. I think it'd be nice to dig a little bit more into, you make this important point that people are just now starting to pick up on whether rank effects shift search costs, which means I just find it more convenient to click on top versus the bottom, or whether they move around expectations. I know on average there's a more profitable hotel or a more attractive hotel in the top positions. But generally, I think it's very hard to disentangle those two things. So Jessica Fong and Oliver Nathan have a recent paper where they run an experiment specifically to go after this. And they make the case that with common data, you couldn't do it, right? So the idea is better expectations or lower search costs both lead to higher clicks, but the purchase decision depends on realized utility, not expectations and not search costs. Those are sort of gone. And so they both seem to shift things in a very similar way. So I think it'd be, if you can disentangle them, and I agree that it sort of matters with standard data, like the Expedia data that everybody has, I think that'd be another thing that'd be worthwhile digging into. That's what I have. So yeah, thank you.